Hi again. We're doing part 5 of the chapter The Risen Lord by F.F. Bruce in this book, The Real Jesus. The time and manner of the resurrection. The resurrection appearances took place over a period of some weeks, both in Jerusalem or its vicinity and in Galilee. It is perhaps possible to arrange them in a chronological pattern which bears some relation to the sacred calendar of Israel at that time of year. Pilgrims who had come from Galilee to Jerusalem for Passover and the ensuing week's festival of unleavened bread would make their way home again after the festival. Some of them would return to Jerusalem a few weeks later to be there for the festival of Pentecost, which fell 7 weeks after Passover. This could provide an explanation for the earlier appearances taking place in and around Jerusalem, later ones in Galilee, and the final one near Jerusalem. But there can be no certainty on this score. One thing seems clear. After a few weeks, the appearances came to a decisive end. The last one ended with Jesus disappearing from the disciples' view in circumstances which showed them that he had been taken into the presence of God. The cloud which, according to Luke, received him out of their sight, Acts 1:9, is the cloud which enveloped the divine glory. The appearances did not all take the same form. At times, the risen Lord seems to have been recognized instantly. More often, he was not recognized or was mistaken for someone else until, by familiar voice or gesture, he made his identity known. But the outcome was to leave the disciples in no doubt that, contrary to the expectation of his friends and enemies alike, the Lord was risen indeed. The resurrection faith came to life in their hearts because of the objective resurrection fact, which took place independently of them and made its inescapable impact on them. Jesus, the crucified one, was brought back from death and appeared to them as the living one, alive forevermore. Now he has his last subhead of the chapter, the Hinge event. It is the resurrection event that forms the hinge between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. There is no clear-cut frontier between the two, as though one should say that it was the Jesus of history who was crucified and the Christ of faith who rose again. Christ crucified is a historical figure indeed, but Christ crucified is very much the object of his people's faith. Christ risen is also the object of his people's faith, for Christ crucified and Christ risen are not two Christs, but one. But Christ risen is at the same time a figure of history. If nothing intervened between Jesus' burial and the disciples' conviction that he had been raised from the dead, the historian would be left with a credibility gap. As a pure historian, he might be content to say that something happened after Jesus' death and burial sufficient to account for the rise of the resurrection faith, without committing himself on the precise nature of that something. Where historical research can go no farther, the primitive Christian witness affirms that something was Christ being raised from death by the power of God. The disciples recognized the Lord who appeared to them in resurrection as identical with the Lord whom they had known before his death, the Jesus of history. But they quickly became aware that he now belonged to a different order of existence. He became less and less accessible to them as the Jesus of history, and more accessible as the Christ of faith. The Christ of faith was indeed this same Jesus as they had seen and heard during his earthly ministry, but he was now withdrawn from them in that earlier form in order to be nearer to them in this new form, nearer not only to them, but also to the rapidly increasing number of believers who had never known him in the old form. Which brings us to the question, if we are ex-Jehovah's Witnesses or present Jehovah's Witnesses, do Jehovah's Witnesses qualify as witnesses? Because according to the data of both the book of Acts and the Gospel of John at the end of the New Testament period, witness has a very technical meaning in the New Testament. And that's why this chapter is so important, in that the independent witnesses of Peter, James, and Paul, all of whom claim to have had direct experiences of Christ, 2 unbelievers as well as 1 believer, and 500 others that are mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15. They qualify as witnesses because they had a direct experience of the risen Christ. So do Jehovah's Witnesses qualify as witnesses in that Jewish technical sense? So I'll put up a video we did on Acts chapter 1 where the credentials of a witness are examined by Peter and the other surviving members of the 11.